You're nothing but a pathetic little girl pretending to be a teacher. Get on the ground where you belong, with the rest of the trash." The words echoed through Roosevelt High School's empty teacher's lounge as Coach Roger Steele pressed his size 13 athletic shoe down on Katie Williams's shoulder, pinning the 24-year-old substitute teacher to the cold linoleum floor. The timestamp on her hidden body camera read 14:22 and 15 seconds on a Tuesday afternoon. In exactly 72 hours, the Staff Evaluation Committee would decide whether she deserved a permanent position or would be blacklisted from education forever. Katie's voice came out steady, despite the shooting pain in her shoulder. "Try saying that on the ground." The irony was thick enough to cut. Here stood Roger Steele, 6'3" and 240 pounds of former college football glory, using his physical dominance to intimidate a woman who barely reached 5'4". What he didn't know was that every second of this assault was being captured in high definition by 3 different devices: the micro camera, disguised as a button on her blazer, her smartphone recording audio from her pocket, and the backup device hidden in her bag across the room. 3 cameras, 1 mistake, 0 escape. The teacher's lounge at Roosevelt High had transformed into Katie's personal battlefield over the past 2 weeks since she'd started as a substitute teacher. What began as her dream opportunity to transition from computer forensics analyst to educator had morphed into a systematic campaign of harassment that seemed orchestrated with military precision. Every morning at 7:15 when she entered the building, hostile energy radiated from certain staff members. Every lunch period, when she sought a moment of peace, someone would appear to remind her she didn't belong. Every evening when she stayed late preparing lessons, hoping to prove herself worthy of permanence, Roger and his crew materialized like clockwork with their intimidation tactics. But Katie Williams wasn't just any substitute teacher. Before following her passion for education, she'd spent 3 years as a digital forensics specialist for a major tech company, specializing in data recovery and evidence preservation. She understood how to document everything, create redundant backups, and most importantly, recognize patterns in seemingly random events. The harassment she experienced wasn't random at all. It followed schedules, escalated predictably, and always coincided with specific administrative meetings and budget discussions. The pressure on Katie's shoulders suddenly released as Roger stepped back, his laugh bouncing off the walls like shattered glass. "Get up, Williams. Stop being so dramatic. If you can't handle a little friendly initiation, how are you going to manage a classroom full of teenagers?" Katie pushed herself up slowly, ensuring the camera captured every angle of the scene. Her shoulder throbbed, but she kept her expression neutral. Years of dealing with hostile corporate executives had taught her that showing weakness only encouraged bullies. As she stood, she noticed Sandra Coleman watching from the doorway. The veteran teacher and union representative's face creased with what appeared to be genuine concern. Sandra had been the only staff member to show Katie any kindness since her arrival, often intervening when Roger's behavior crossed lines and advocating for her with the administration. "Roger, that's enough," Sandra said, stepping into the room with the authority that came from 20 years of teaching experience. Her silver hair was pulled back in its signature bun, and her wire-rimmed glasses caught the fluorescent lights as she positioned herself between Katie and Roger. "This behavior is completely unacceptable. I'll be filing a formal complaint with the union." Roger's jaw clenched, but he backed away. Even he knew better than to challenge Sandra Coleman directly. She had connections throughout the district, sat on multiple committees, and had Superintendent Bradley Harrison's personal phone number. If Sandra said jump, most administrators asked how high. It was one of the reasons Katie felt so grateful to have her as an ally in this hostile environment. "We were just having a discussion about teaching methodologies," Roger said, his tone shifting to something approximating professionalism. Williams here thinks she can revolutionize physical education with her fancy computer background. I was simply demonstrating why practical experience matters more than theoretical knowledge. Sandra's eyes narrowed behind her glasses. By forcing her to the ground? That looked an awful lot like assault to me, Roger. Katie, are you hurt? Do you need medical attention? Katie rotated her shoulder experimentally, feeling the joint protest with every movement. I'm fine, Sandra. Thank you for intervening. You should file an incident report immediately, Sandra insisted, pulling out her phone. I can help you with the paperwork. The union takes workplace harassment very seriously, especially when it involves physical intimidation. Roger snorted derisively. Harassment? Come on, Sandy. You've been here long enough to know the difference between harassment and normal staff interaction. Not everyone gets coddled like your favorites. The tension in the room ratcheted up another notch. Katie noticed how Roger's hands had balled into fists at his sides, how his weight shifted forward onto the balls of his feet like he was preparing for a tackle. She also noticed something else her forensics training had taught her to spot. The timing of his aggression wasn't random. She'd been reviewing the athletic department's budget reports when Roger had burst in. She'd had spreadsheets open on her laptop showing fund transfers from the past 6 months, documents she'd accessed using the temporary credentials given to her as part of her substitute teaching duties. I think I'll take a walk, Katie said carefully, gathering her belongings while ensuring her laptop screen remained visible to the cameras for a few more seconds. Clear my head before my next class. Smart move, Roger muttered, but Sandra shot him a warning look that could have frozen fire. As Katie headed for the door, Sandra fell into step beside her. Come to my classroom immediately, she said quietly. We need to document this properly. I've been keeping track of Roger's behavior toward new staff members, and your case is particularly egregious. Did you know you're the 4th substitute teacher he's driven out this year? Thanks for standing with teachers who fight back against workplace harassment. If you believe every educator deserves dignity and respect in their workplace, hit that like button right now. Subscribe to see how Katie turns the tables on her tormentors using methods you won't believe. And if you want to support more stories that expose workplace corruption, please consider hitting that thanks button below. This investigation is about to take a turn that nobody saw coming. Katie followed Sandra down the hallway, her analytical mind racing through possibilities. 4 substitute teachers in 1 year represented a pattern, not coincidence. As they walked, she noticed how other staff members averted their eyes, how conversations stopped mid-sentence when they passed. The culture of fear at Roosevelt High ran deeper than just Roger's bullying. It was systemic, embedded in the very fabric of the school's daily operations. Sandra's classroom was a haven of organization and warmth, with motivational posters covering every wall and thriving plants on every available surface. She closed the door behind them and gestured for Katie to sit at one of the student desks while she retrieved a thick folder from her locked filing cabinet. I've been documenting workplace violations at this school for 3 years, Sandra said, spreading papers across her desk with the precision of a prosecutor preparing for trial. Roger is just the tip of a very large iceberg. Principal Mitchell turns a blind eye because Roger brings in wins for the athletic program, and wins mean funding. But what Roger doesn't know is that I've been building a case that goes all the way to the district level. Katie leaned forward, her analytical mind immediately drawn to the documents. These are all incident reports? Every single one filed according to union protocols, Sandra confirmed. But here's the interesting part. Notice the dates. Katie studied the papers, her trained eye catching the pattern immediately. They cluster around specific times, end of month usually, and they intensify during budget review periods. Sandra smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. You really do have a sharp mind. Yes, there's definitely a correlation between the harassment incidents and financial cycles. I've suspected for months that something irregular is happening with the athletic department's funds, but I haven't been able to prove it. What kind of irregularities? Katie asked, though she suspected she already knew part of the answer from her own informal investigation. Sandra pulled out another folder, this one marked confidential in red letters. The athletic budget is supposed to be $180,000 annually, but when you add up all the documented expenses, equipment purchases, travel costs, and salaries, we're somehow spending close to $200,000. The extra $20,000 comes from somewhere, but it's not in any official budget line. Katie's pulse quickened. This was bigger than workplace harassment. This was potential embezzlement, fraud, and conspiracy. Her fingers itched to dive into the financial data with her forensics tools, to trace every transaction and follow the money trail to its source. Have you reported this to anyone? Katie asked. Sandra sighed, removing her glasses to clean them with practiced movements. I tried. I went to Principal Mitchell first, but he said I was overstepping my boundaries. Then I took it to the district financial officer, but she said without concrete evidence, there was nothing to investigate. That's why I need someone like you, Katie. Someone with the technical skills to find what I know is hidden there. Katie felt a chill run down her spine. Was this why she was really being targeted? Not because she was new or young or female, but because someone suspected she might uncover their financial crimes. She thought back to Roger's reaction when he'd seen her looking at the budget reports. The violence in his response suddenly made perfect sense. I can help, Katie said carefully, but I'll need access to more than just the public budget documents. I'll need transaction records, vendor contracts, purchase orders, everything. Sandra's face lit up with what seemed like genuine relief. I can get you that access. As union representative, I have certain privileges. But Katie, you need to be extremely careful. If Roger finds out what we're doing, the harassment will get worse. He might even become dangerous. Katie touched the hidden camera on her blazer. I'm already documenting everything, every interaction, every threat, every moment of intimidation. If he escalates, I'll have proof. Smart girl, Sandra said approvingly. I knew there was something special about you the moment you walked in here. Most substitute teachers just try to survive their assignments, but you're different. You're a fighter. Over the next hour, Sandra walked Katie through 3 years of documentation. The pattern became increasingly clear with each page. Roger's harassment always intensified when someone got too close to the athletic department's finances. The previous substitute teacher, a man named David Harrison, had been accessing budget records when Roger orchestrated a campaign that ended with Harrison being accused of inappropriate conduct with students, though the charges were later dropped. Before him, a woman named Lisa Park had tried to report discrepancies in equipment purchases, only to find herself the subject of vicious rumors about her personal life that made her position untenable. It's like he's protecting something, Katie observed, cross-referencing dates on her laptop. Or someone. Sandra nodded gravely. That's exactly what I think. Roger isn't smart enough to orchestrate a financial fraud scheme on his own. He's muscle, not brains. Someone else is pulling the strings, using him as an enforcer to keep people from looking too closely at the money. Katie's mind raced through possibilities. Principal Mitchell was the obvious suspect, given his position and his refusal to investigate. But there were others with access to the funds. The assistant principal, the financial secretary, even certain school board members. The conspiracy could reach higher than anyone suspected. I need you to know something, Sandra said suddenly, her voice dropping to barely above a whisper. Tomorrow afternoon, there's going to be a special meeting. Off the books. not on any official calendar. Roger, Principal Mitchell, and several others are gathering in the auxiliary gym at 4:30. I only know about it because I overheard Roger on the phone this morning. He mentioned something about cleaning up loose ends before the evaluation. Katie's blood ran cold. The evaluation was in less than 72 hours. If they were planning to clean up loose ends, that could only mean one thing. They were going to ensure she never got the permanent position, and probably make certain she never taught anywhere again. "Do you think they know I've been looking at the financial records?" Katie asked. Sandra hesitated, then nodded slowly. Roger's reaction today wasn't random. He must have seen something that spooked him. "Katie, I think you should consider withdrawing your application for the permanent position. It's not worth risking your career or your safety." But Katie was already formulating a plan. Her forensics background had taught her that criminals always made mistakes when they felt threatened. They moved money too quickly, communicated carelessly, left digital footprints in their haste to cover their tracks. If Roger and his conspirators were panicking, this was exactly the time to press forward. "I'm not backing down," Katie said firmly, "but I am going to need help. Can you get me into that meeting tomorrow? Not officially, just close enough to observe and record?" Sandra looked uncertain. "That's dangerous, Katie. If they catch you—" "They won't," Katie assured her. "I have equipment they've never seen. Military-grade surveillance tools from my forensics days, micro cameras, long-range audio pickups, even thermal imaging if necessary. I can monitor that meeting from the next room and they'll never know I was there." Sandra studied her for a long moment, then smiled slowly. "You really aren't just any substitute teacher, are you?" "No," Katie admitted. "But teaching is what I want to do with my life. I'm not going to let Roger and his cronies drive me out like they did the others. Someone needs to stand up to them." "Then we do it smart," Sandra said, pulling out her phone. "I'm going to call in some favors. There's a retired detective who does private investigation work now. He owes me from when I helped his daughter get into college. He can help us make sure any evidence we gather will hold up in court." As Sandra made the call, Katie reviewed the data on her laptop. The athletic fund transfers followed a specific pattern. 20,000 here, 15,000 there, always just under the amounts that would trigger automatic review. The money went to vendor accounts that seemed legitimate on the surface: sports equipment suppliers, uniform companies, transportation services. But when she cross-referenced the vendor tax IDs with state business registrations, several came back as defunct or had never existed in the first place. "He'll meet us tonight," Sandra said, ending her call. 8 p.m. at the coffee shop on 5th Street. He says if we can prove embezzlement, the FBI might get involved. This could be bigger than just our school. Katie felt a surge of adrenaline. This was what she'd been trained for, what her analytical mind craved. Not just catching workplace bullies, but exposing systematic corruption that hurt students and taxpayers. The athletic funds being stolen were meant for student programs, equipment that could help kids get college scholarships, opportunities that could change lives. Her phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. When she opened it, her blood ran cold. It was a photo of her car in the school parking lot with a message, "Back off, or this gets worse." She showed it to Sandra, whose face went pale. "They're escalating already. Katie, maybe we should go to the police right now." "With what?" Katie asked. "A threatening text from an unknown number? Roger would just deny it, and we'd tip our hand about the investigation. No, we stick to the plan. But I am going to take some precautions." She pulled out her phone and activated several apps she'd installed, but hoped never to use. One would back up all her data to multiple cloud servers every hour. Another would track her location and send alerts to predetermined contacts if she didn't check in regularly. A third would live stream audio and video to a secure server if triggered by certain keywords or sudden movements. "You really came prepared," Sandra observed with admiration. "I learned the hard way that hope for the best, but prepare for the worst, isn't just a saying," Katie replied. "At my last job, I investigated a case where someone was selling customer data. They tried to intimidate me too, but I had everything backed up in triplicate, and when they tried to destroy the evidence, I just pulled it from my secure servers. They're in federal prison now." Sandra whistled low. "Remind me never to get on your bad side." They spent another hour going through the documents, with Katie taking photographs of everything and uploading them to her encrypted cloud storage. Every transaction, every suspicious pattern, every piece of evidence that pointed to financial malfeasance. By the time they finished, the sun was setting outside, casting long shadows across the empty classroom. "I should go," Katie said, packing up her things. "I need to prepare for tomorrow." "Be careful," Sandra warned. "Roger usually stays late on Tuesdays for basketball practice. Try to avoid the gym area." Katie nodded, but as she headed for the door, Sandra called her back. "Wait, there's something else you should know." Sandra hesitated, clearly struggling with whether to share whatever was on her mind. "Roger has a gambling problem. Sports betting mostly. He owes money to some dangerous people. I overheard him on the phone last week, pleading for more time to pay. That might be why he's involved in whatever this is." The piece clicked into place in Katie's mind. Roger needed money desperately, making him the perfect patsy for someone smarter to manipulate. He provided the muscle and intimidation while someone else handled the complex financial manipulation. But who? As Katie walked through the darkening hallways of Roosevelt High, her footsteps echoing off the polished floors, she couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched. Security cameras tracked her movement, their red lights blinking steadily. She wondered who was on the other end, watching her every move. The parking lot was nearly empty when she reached it, just her small Honda Civic and a few other vehicles scattered across the asphalt. As she approached her car, she noticed something tucked under her windshield wiper. Another message. This one written in block letters on a piece of athletic department letterhead. "You've been warned." She photographed it carefully, making sure to capture not just the message but the letterhead, the watermark, even the specific way the paper had been folded. Every detail could be important later. As she did, she heard footsteps behind her. "Working late again, Williams?" She turned to find Roger standing 10 feet away, his bulky frame silhouetted against the lights of the gymnasium. He was still in his coaching attire, a whistle hanging around his neck like a badge of authority. "Just heading home," Katie said evenly, her hand moving subtly to ensure her camera was recording. "Good idea," Roger said, taking a step closer. "These parking lots can be dangerous after dark. All sorts of accidents can happen. Cars get vandalized, tires get slashed, sometimes people even get hurt." The threat was barely veiled, but Katie stood her ground. "That sounds like something the police would be very interested in hearing about." Roger laughed, a harsh sound that carried across the empty lot. "The police? You think they care about some substitute teacher's paranoid fantasies? Sheriff Morrison's kid is on my basketball team. Deputy Chief Roberts. He sponsors our football program. You really think they're going to take your word over mine?" The corruption ran deeper than Katie had imagined. If local law enforcement was compromised, she'd need to go higher. State police, maybe even federal authorities. But first, she needed irrefutable evidence. "I think the truth has a way of coming out," Katie said, unlocking her car. "No matter how many people try to bury it." "Truth?" Roger spat the word like it tasted bitter. "You want to know the truth? The truth is, you don't belong here. You're not a real teacher." You're just some tech nerd playing dress-up, pretending you can make a difference. These kids don't need your fancy computer programs and digital lessons. They need discipline, structure, authority, things you know nothing about. Katie slid into her driver's seat but kept the door open, making sure her camera captured Roger's increasingly agitated state. Is that what you tell yourself when you're stealing from their programs? That it's for their own good? The change in Roger was instantaneous. His face went from red to purple, veins bulging in his neck. He lunged forward, grabbing the car door, but Katie was ready. She pulled it shut and locked it in one smooth motion, starting the engine as Roger pounded on the window. "You have no idea what you're messing with," he shouted, spittle flying from his mouth. "This goes so much higher than you think. They'll bury you." Katie put the car in reverse, but before she pulled away, she lowered the window just an inch. "Then they better dig deep, because I don't stay buried." She drove off, leaving Roger standing in the parking lot, his shouts fading in her rearview mirror. Her hands shook as the adrenaline coursed through her system, but she kept them steady on the wheel. She'd pushed him hard, maybe too hard, but his reaction had revealed more than he'd intended. This wasn't just about skimming athletic funds. There was a larger conspiracy at play, one that reached into law enforcement and possibly beyond. The coffee shop on 5th Street was mostly empty when Katie arrived early for her meeting with Sandra's detective friend. She chose a corner booth with clear sight lines to both entrances and settled in with her laptop, using the time to review the financial data she'd collected. The patterns were becoming clearer with each analysis. The fake vendor accounts had been created systematically over 2 years, each one used for only a few transactions before being abandoned. It was sophisticated, the kind of scheme that required intimate knowledge of the school's financial systems and approval processes. Sandra arrived right at 8, followed by a man in his 60s who moved with the careful precision of someone who'd spent decades in law enforcement. He had silver hair, sharp blue eyes, and the kind of weathered face that suggested he'd seen too much, but hadn't let it break him. "Katie, this is Detective Ray Morrison, retired," Sandra said as they slid into the booth across from her. "Ray, this is the young woman I told you about." Morrison studied Katie with professional interest. "Sandra says you have evidence of embezzlement at Roosevelt High." "More than that," Katie said, turning her laptop screen toward them. "I have evidence of a systematic fraud scheme involving at least $180,000 over 2 years, fake vendor accounts, and a conspiracy that includes school administration and possibly local law enforcement." While we're deep into Katie's investigation, I have to ask you something. Have you ever witnessed corruption at your workplace that everyone knew about but nobody would address? What did you do about it? Share your story in the comments below. Because what Katie discovers next will make you rethink everything about how deep workplace conspiracies can go. Morrison whistled low as Katie walked him through her findings. His expression grew increasingly serious as she showed him the threatening messages, the video of Roger's assault, and the pattern of harassment against anyone who got close to discovering the truth. This is solid preliminary work," Morrison said finally. "But you're right about local law enforcement being a problem. Sheriff Morrison is my cousin, and while he's not corrupt, he's willfully blind when it comes to the school's athletic program. His son Tommy is banking on a basketball scholarship, and Roger Steele controls those recommendations." "So what do we do?" Sandra asked. Morrison pulled out a card and slid it across the table to Katie. "FBI Special Agent Jennifer Walsh. She works financial crimes out of the state capitol. I worked with her on a municipal corruption case 3 years ago. She's thorough, fearless, and most importantly, completely outside the local good old boys network." Katie took the card, feeling a surge of hope. Will she take this seriously? If you can prove what you've shown me, she'll take it very seriously, Morrison assured her. Federal agencies love school corruption cases. Good publicity, clear victims, and usually the perpetrators aren't sophisticated enough to cover their tracks completely. But Katie, once you bring in the FBI, there's no going back. These people will come at you with everything they have. They already are, Katie pointed out. At least with the FBI involved, I'll have protection. Morrison nodded approvingly. Smart thinking. Now, about this meeting tomorrow. You said you want to surveil it? Katie outlined her plan, and Morrison made several suggestions for improvement. He recommended positioning, backup recording devices, and even offered to be nearby in case something went wrong. By the time they finished strategizing, it was nearly 10 p.m. Get some rest, Morrison advised as they prepared to leave. Tomorrow's going to be intense. And Katie, that camera you're wearing? Good choice on the model, but tomorrow, wear a backup. These people are getting desperate, and desperate people do stupid things.
As Katie drove home, she couldn't shake the feeling that she was being followed. A dark sedan had been behind her since she left the coffee shop, maintaining a steady distance but taking every turn she did. When she deliberately took a wrong turn into a residential neighborhood, the sedan continued straight. But another car, a pickup truck, appeared in her mirrors moments later. They were taking turns following her. That level of coordination suggested this was more organized than just Roger and a few corrupt administrators. Katie's mind raced through possibilities as she took a circuitous route home, using techniques she'd learned from a security consultant at her old job. Double back at intersections, sudden turns without signaling, pulling into parking lots with multiple exits. By the time she reached her apartment complex, she was certain she'd lost her tail, but the damage was done. They knew where she lived. As she climbed the stairs to her second-floor unit, she made a mental note to stay elsewhere tomorrow night. Maybe Sandra could recommend a safe place. Inside her apartment, Katie immediately went to work. She uploaded all her evidence to multiple secure cloud servers, created encrypted backups on physical drives that she would hide in separate locations, and set up automated systems that would release the information to media contacts if she didn't check in every 12 hours. It was paranoid, maybe, but paranoia had kept her safe in dangerous situations before. She was just finishing her preparations when her phone rang. Unknown number. Hello? Heavy breathing on the other end, then a disguised voice, clearly using some kind of voice modulator. You're making a mistake. Walk away now, and you can still have a career in education. Continue this path, and you'll never teach again. Who is this? Katie demanded, though she was already recording the call. Someone who's trying to help you. Roger Steele is nothing. He's a puppet. You're pulling strings that are attached to much more dangerous things. Last warning. The line went dead. Katie stared at her phone, processing this new information. Someone was trying to scare her off, but they'd also revealed something important. They were concerned enough to make direct contact, which meant she was closer to the truth than she'd realized. And the mention of Roger being a puppet confirmed her suspicions that someone else was orchestrating the fraud. She pulled up the school's organizational chart on her laptop, studying the power structure. Principal Mitchell was the obvious suspect, but what if it went higher? What if someone on the school board or even at the district level was involved? The scope of the conspiracy could be massive. Her phone buzzed with a text from Sandra. Just got home safely. Are you okay? Katie replied that she was fine, but mentioned the phone call. Sandra's response was immediate. Pack a bag. You're staying with me tonight. No arguments. Grateful for the offer,
Katie quickly packed essentials, including all her surveillance equipment and backup drives. As she was leaving, she noticed something that made her blood run cold. Her doormat had been moved. It was subtle, just a few inches, but she always positioned it exactly parallel to the doorframe. Someone had been here. She backed away from the door slowly, pulling out her phone to call Morrison. He answered on the second ring. "They've been in my apartment," she said without preamble.
"Get out now," Morrison commanded. "Don't go back inside. Meet me at the 24-hour diner on Route 9. I'll call Sandra and tell her to meet us there, too."
Katie practically ran to her car, her heart pounding. As she drove away, she saw lights turn on in her apartment. They were still there, probably searching for her evidence. Thank God she'd already uploaded everything to the cloud. The diner was bright and busy despite the late hour, full of shift workers and insomniacs nursing coffee and pie. Katie found Morrison already there, sitting where he could watch the door. His hand rested casually near his hip, where she suspected he still carried a weapon despite being retired. "You did the right thing getting out," he said as she slid into the booth. "I've called Agent Walsh. She's driving down tonight." This thing just became an active federal investigation. Sandra arrived minutes later, looking frazzled but determined. "This is escalating faster than we expected. Katie, I'm so sorry I got you involved in this." "You didn't get me involved," Katie said firmly. "They involved me the moment they decided to use harassment to cover up their crimes. I just refused to be another victim who walked away quietly." Morrison's phone rang. He listened for a moment, then his expression darkened. "There's a fire at Katie's apartment building. Fire department is responding now." Katie felt numb. They'd actually torched her apartment to destroy evidence they thought might be there. These people weren't just corrupt, they were dangerous. But they'd also just made a critical mistake. Arson was a federal crime, and it would bring even more law enforcement attention to their conspiracy. "The good news is, Agent Walsh will be here in 2 hours, Morrison continued. "The bad news is, that tells us tomorrow's meeting is probably about more than just intimidation. They're planning something big, maybe moving the stolen money offshore or destroying financial records. We need to surveil that meeting no matter what." "It's too dangerous now," Sandra protested. "They've shown they're willing to commit serious crimes to protect themselves." "Which is exactly why we can't back down," Katie argued. "If we don't get evidence tomorrow, they'll have time to cover their tracks completely. Agent Walsh will arrive to find nothing but ashes and deleted files." Morrison nodded slowly. "She's right. But we do this my way. I'll be on site as backup. Katie, you set up your surveillance equipment, but you stay mobile. First sign of trouble, you get out. Sandra, you need to maintain your cover. Act normal tomorrow. Don't let on that you know anything." They spent the next hour planning every detail of tomorrow's operation. Katie would arrive early, before the school's security staff did their afternoon rounds. She'd position micro-cameras in the auxiliary gym's ventilation system and hide audio receivers in the storage areas. Morrison would be in the parking lot in an unmarked van, monitoring the feeds and ready to intervene if necessary. Sandra would stay visible in the main building, providing an alibi and early warning if anyone went looking for Katie. "One more thing," Morrison said as they prepared to leave. "That voice modulator on the phone call, that's not something Roger Steele would have. Someone with technical knowledge is involved in this. Be extra careful tomorrow." Katie and Sandra drove to Sandra's house in Sandra's car, leaving Katie's vehicle at the diner. Sandra lived in a modest 2-story home in a quiet neighborhood, the kind of place where everyone knew everyone, and strangers were noticed immediately. It was as safe as anywhere could be under the circumstances. "Guest rooms upstairs," Sandra said, leading the way. There's a lock on the door, and the windows have security bars. Previous owner was paranoid about break-ins. Katie was grateful for the paranoia. She set up her equipment on the desk, checking all her feeds and backups one more time. Everything was still secure in the cloud. Multiple copies spread across servers in different countries. Even if they destroyed every physical piece of evidence, the digital trail would survive. As she worked, Sandra brought her tea and sat on the bed. "Can I ask you something? Why teaching? With your skills, you could make 3 times as much staying in tech." Katie paused, considering her answer. "Because in tech, I was just moving data around, making rich companies richer. But teaching? That's about shaping minds, giving kids tools to change their lives. My computer skills are just tools. Teaching is the purpose." Sandra smiled sadly. "That's what I thought, too, 20 years ago. But the system beats you down. The politics, the bureaucracy, the corruption. Sometimes I wonder if I've made any difference at all." "You made a difference to me," Katie said. "If you hadn't been there today, hadn't stood up to Roger, I might have given up. And tomorrow, we're going to make a difference to every student whose programs were robbed to feed someone's greed." They talked for another hour about teaching philosophy, about the students Sandra had influenced over the years, about the dreams they both had for education reform. It was a reminder of why this fight mattered, why Katie couldn't just walk away despite the danger. The next morning came too quickly. Katie had barely slept, her mind running through scenarios and contingency plans. She dressed in dark clothing that would help her blend into shadows, attached her cameras and recording devices, and reviewed the building plans one more time. "You don't have to do this," Sandra said over breakfast. "We could wait for Agent Walsh. Let the FBI handle everything." "By then, it might be too late," Katie replied. "They're spooked. They'll destroy evidence, move money, maybe even flee. We need what happens in that meeting." They drove to school separately, maintaining the appearance of normalcy. Katie taught her morning classes on autopilot, her mind focused on what was coming. At 2:30, she slipped away from the main building and made her way to the maintenance entrance Morrison had identified. The tunnels were dark and humid, filled with the sounds of pipes and ventilation systems. Katie moved carefully, following the route she'd memorized. Every shadow could hide a threat. Every sound could signal discovery. But she pressed on, driven by determination to expose the truth. She reached the auxiliary gym's storage room without incident and quickly went to work placing her surveillance equipment. The cameras were state-of-the-art, virtually invisible once positioned. The audio receivers could pick up whispers from 30 feet away. Everything fed directly to Morrison's van and her backup servers. By 4:15, she was in position, hidden behind equipment racks where she could monitor everything on her phone. Her heart pounded as she heard voices approaching. This was it, the moment of truth. The door opened, and people filed in. Roger Steele, Principal Mitchell, 2 school board members, the district financial officer, Linda Harper, and surprisingly, Sheriff Morrison himself. But there was one more person, and when Katie saw who it was, her blood ran cold. Sandra Coleman walked in, and Katie's world shattered. "Sorry I'm late," Sandra said, her voice completely different from the warm, supportive tone Katie knew. "Had to make sure our little investigator was properly positioned." Katie's phone nearly slipped from her numb fingers. Sandra. Sandra had been part of it all along. Everything made sense now. The way she'd guided Katie toward certain evidence while steering her away from others. How she'd always been there to comfort her after Roger's attacks, positioning herself as the only trustworthy ally. But before you find out what happens next in this shocking betrayal, I need to know. Have you ever discovered that someone you completely trusted was actually working against you? How did you handle that betrayal? Share your experience in the comments, because Katie's response to this revelation will determine everything. Did she buy the whole union representative fighting for justice act? Roger asked with cruel amusement. Sandra laughed, a sound like breaking glass. Completely! She even stayed at my house last night. I know every piece of evidence she has, every backup location, every contact she's made. The FBI agent Morrison contacted. I've been feeding her false information for hours, sending her on a wild goose chase 3 towns over. Katie's mind raced. If Sandra had been monitoring her all along, then they knew about the cameras. This was a trap. But wait, Sandra didn't know about all the protocols Katie had activated. The ones that were recording everything right now and transmitting it to servers Sandra didn't know existed. The girl's probably listening right now, Sheriff Morrison said, looking directly at one of the cameras Katie had placed. Come on out, Miss Williams. Let's discuss this like adults. Katie had 2 choices: run and hope Morrison could protect her, or face them and try to get more evidence. She chose the latter, stepping out from her hiding place with her hands visible. The wannabe detective, Sandra said mockingly. Did you really think you were smart enough to outsmart people who've been doing this for years? Wait, Katie asked, looking directly at Sandra. Why pretend to help me? Because we needed to know how much you knew, Sandra explained coldly. You were getting too close too fast with that forensics background. So I became your friend, your mentor, your ally. Fed you just enough truth mixed with lies to keep you busy while we cleaned up our trail. Except you didn't clean it well enough, Katie said, her voice steadier than she felt. The vendor accounts are still traceable. The money trail leads right back to you. Not anymore, Linda Harper said, holding up a tablet. As of 10 minutes ago, all those accounts are closed. The money transferred to offshore holdings, and the records destroyed. Your evidence proves nothing. But Katie smiled slightly. You think I only backed up financial records? I've been recording everything. Every conversation, every threat, every admission of guilt. And it's not just on the servers you know about, Sandra. I have protocols you never discovered. Sandra's confident expression faltered. You're bluffing. Am I? Should I tell them about the 200,000 you skimmed on top of what you're sharing with them? Katie watched Sandra's face go white. Oh, you didn't know I found those accounts? The ones under your maiden name? Your mother's maiden name? The shell company registered in Delaware? The room erupted in chaos. Roger turned on Sandra. You've been stealing from the stealing? She's lying, Sandra protested, but the doubt was planted. Actually, I'm not, Katie said, pulling out a second phone Sandra didn't know about. I've been documenting everything, including Sandra's private embezzlement scheme. She's been using all of you as cover while she takes the biggest share. Linda Harper snatched the tablet from Sandra's hands, frantically searching through financial records. These transfers, Sandra, these aren't part of our arrangement. This is what criminals do, Katie said calmly. They turn on each other when threatened. Sandra's been planning to let you all take the fall while she disappears with the real money. Sheriff Morrison's hand moved to his weapon. Everyone calm down. We can sort this out. No, we can't, Katie said, because Agent Walsh isn't 3 towns over. She's been in the parking lot for the last 20 minutes with a full tactical team, watching everything through the cameras I placed. The ones Sandra didn't know about, because I placed them after I left her house this morning. Everyone froze. Katie continued, The fire? At my apartment? Federal crime. Crossing state lines to intimidate a witness? Federal crime. Embezzlement of funds that included federal grants? Federal crime. You're not dealing with local police anymore. As if on cue, the doors burst open. FBI, nobody move. Hands where we can see them. Tactical teams flooded in, weapons drawn. Agent Walsh entered behind them, her badge prominent. You're all under arrest for conspiracy to commit fraud, embezzlement, attempted murder, and about 15 other charges we're still tallying. Sandra tried to run, but was tackled immediately. Roger didn't even resist, his shoulders slumping in defeat. Sheriff Morrison carefully placed his weapon on the ground and raised his hands, knowing resistance would only make things worse. "You little witch!" Sandra screamed as she was handcuffed. "You destroyed everything!" "No," Katie said quietly. "You destroyed everything when you chose to steal from children's programs, when you chose to betray the trust of teachers who looked up to you, when you chose greed over integrity." As the conspirators were led away, Agent Walsh approached Katie. "That was incredibly dangerous, what you did, but also incredibly brave. Your recordings will ensure convictions for all of them." "What about the money?" Katie asked. "Already frozen. Thanks to your documentation, we've recovered over $400,000. It'll all go back to the school programs." Walsh smiled. "You did good, Katie. Really good." The aftermath was swift and comprehensive. The FBI investigation revealed that Sandra had been running similar schemes at 2 previous schools. Roger's gambling debts had made him easy to manipulate. Principal Mitchell was just weak, going along to avoid conflict. The school board members had been bought with promises of kickbacks for their own businesses. Linda Harper had used her position to facilitate everything, believing she was too smart to get caught. Within hours, Roosevelt High was swarming with federal agents, seizing computers, documents, and evidence. The local news picked up the story immediately. Substitute teacher expose massive school corruption scandal ran on every channel. But Katie wasn't interested in fame. She had a job to finish. Despite everything, her 72-hour evaluation period wasn't over. The remaining school board members, the ones not arrested, held an emergency meeting. Given the circumstances, Katie's evaluation seemed almost absurd, but she insisted on completing it. "I came here to teach," she told them. "That's still what I want to do." The evaluation was unanimous. Not only did Katie get the permanent position, but she was also asked to help develop new oversight protocols to prevent future corruption. She declined the administrative role, but accepted a position teaching computer science and digital citizenship, where she could teach students the skills that had helped her expose the conspiracy. 6 months later, Katie stood in her permanent classroom, watching her students work on a project about digital forensics and ethics. The walls were covered with newspaper clippings about the case, reminders that one person with courage and skills could make a difference. Roger Steele was serving 5 years in federal prison. Principal Mitchell got 3 years after cooperating with prosecutors. Linda Harper received 7 years, her meticulous records becoming evidence against her. Sheriff Morrison faced the harshest sentence, 10 years, his betrayal of public trust earning extra time. And Sandra Coleman? She was looking at 20 years. The FBI had connected her to similar schemes dating back a decade, a career built on betrayal and theft. During her sentencing, she'd stared at Katie with pure hatred. But Katie felt only pity. Sandra had possessed such talent, such potential to genuinely help young teachers, and she'd thrown it all away for money. The recovered funds had transformed Roosevelt High. New computers for the technology lab, instruments for the music program, equipment for athletics, books for the library. Every department benefited from the money that had been stolen. The school's test scores were rising, college acceptance rates improving, and most importantly, trust was being rebuilt. Katie often thought about those 72 hours that had changed everything. The timestamp from that first assault, 14:22 and 15 seconds, was burned into her memory. But so was the moment when justice prevailed, when the FBI burst through those doors, when the truth finally came to light. She kept the button camera from that day in a frame on her desk, a reminder that sometimes the smallest tools could topple the biggest corruption. Students would ask about it, and she would tell them the story, not to glorify herself, but to teach them about courage, preparation, and standing up for what's right. "Miss Williams," one student asked during a lesson on digital security, "were you scared?" "Terrified," Katie admitted. But fear isn't a reason to let injustice continue. It's a signal that something important is at stake. As her students worked, Katie looked out the window at the parking lot where Roger had threatened her, at the auxiliary gym where everything had come to a head, at the school that had been transformed by truth and justice. The 72-hour countdown that had started with violence and intimidation had ended with something far more powerful: proof that corruption could be defeated, that bullies could be stopped, and that one person with determination could indeed change everything. The button camera on her desk caught the afternoon light, its lens reflecting like a tiny eye that had seen everything. Katie smiled slightly, remembering Roger's words about her not belonging here. She belonged here more than he ever had. She was a teacher, a real teacher, and she was exactly where she needed to be. The morning after the FBI raid, Roosevelt High School resembled a crime scene from a television drama, except this was painfully real. Yellow tape blocked off the administrative offices, federal agents wheeled out boxes of evidence, and news vans lined the street like predators waiting for their next meal. Katie Williams stood in her temporary classroom, watching the chaos through the window, while her students sat in stunned silence. "Miss Williams," Jessica raised her hand tentatively, "is it true what they're saying? That Mrs. Coleman was stealing from us this whole time?" Katie turned from the window, choosing her words carefully. "What I can tell you is that several people in positions of trust chose to abuse that trust. They took money meant for your education and used it for themselves. But the system worked. They were caught, and the money is being returned." "But Mrs. Coleman was the union rep," another student, Marcus, said with confusion. "She was supposed to protect teachers, not rob the school." "Sometimes the people who seem most trustworthy are the ones capable of the greatest betrayal," Katie replied. "That's why we need systems of accountability, checks and balances, transparency. That's why your generation needs to learn not just to trust, but to verify." The classroom door opened, and Agent Jennifer Walsh entered, her FBI badge clipped to her belt. "Ms. Williams, we need you to come with us. There's been a development." Katie's students looked worried, but she reassured them. "I'll be back. Mr. Henderson from next door will supervise. Keep working on your digital forensics project. Remember, documentation is everything." As she followed Agent Walsh through the hallways, Katie noticed how different the school felt. The oppressive atmosphere that had haunted these corridors for years was lifting. Teachers who had kept their heads down were now talking openly, sharing stories of intimidation they'd been too frightened to report before. Walsh led her to a mobile FBI command center set up in the parking lot. Inside, multiple agents worked at computers, analyzing the mountain of data Katie's surveillance had provided. On one screen, Katie saw her own financial analysis, the one she'd thought Sandra had destroyed. "Your work is remarkable," Walsh said, gesturing to the screens. "We've been doing financial crimes for years, and your documentation methods are some of the best we've seen. But that's not why I brought you here. She pulled up a new file on her tablet. Sandra Coleman is trying to make a deal. She claims she has information about a larger network, similar schemes running in 12 other districts across 3 states. She says she'll provide everything in exchange for reduced charges. Katie felt her anger rise. She betrayed everyone who trusted her, and now she wants leniency? I understand your frustration, Walsh said. But if she's telling the truth, we could be looking at millions in stolen funds and dozens of conspirators. We need someone who understands her methods, someone who can verify if the information she provides is legitimate or if she's trying to manipulate us again. You want me to help verify her claims? More than that, we want you to be present during her debrief. You know her tactics, her tells. You figured out her scheme when trained investigators missed it. We need your insight. Katie considered this. Facing Sandra again would be difficult, but if it meant exposing more corruption and recovering more stolen funds for students, she had to do it. When? Now. She's in custody at the federal building downtown. Are you ready for this? Katie thought about all the substitute teachers who had been driven out before her, all the students whose programs had been defunded, all the trust that had been shattered. I'm ready. The federal building was a fortress of concrete and glass, designed to intimidate and impress in equal measure. Katie went through multiple security checkpoints before reaching the interview room where Sandra Coleman waited, handcuffed to a metal table. The woman who had seemed so maternal and protective just days ago now looked haggard, her carefully maintained appearance crumbling under the weight of her crimes. Sandra's eyes flashed with hatred when Katie entered behind Agent Walsh. Come to gloat? Come to ensure you don't manipulate your way out of this, Katie replied evenly, taking a seat across from her. Sandra's lawyer, a thin man in an expensive suit, placed a protective hand on his client's shoulder. My client is prepared to provide substantial assistance to your investigation in exchange for consideration in sentencing. Walsh pulled out a recorder. Let's hear what she has to say first. Sandra began talking, and Katie had to admit, the scope was staggering. The Roosevelt High scheme was just one tentacle of a much larger operation. Sandra had been recruited 5 years ago by someone she knew only as the architect, a person who identified vulnerable school districts and installed corrupt officials to siphon funds. Each district had the same model, Sandra explained, her voice flat and defeated. Place a trusted figure as the inside person, usually a union rep or senior teacher. Compromise or recruit a financial officer. Find someone with authority who had financial pressure, gambling debts, medical bills, addiction issues. Then create fake vendors, inflate purchases, redirect funds. How much money are we talking about? Walsh asked. Across all districts. Maybe 8 million over 5 years. Katie leaned forward. You're lying. Everyone turned to look at her. Sandra's expression flickered with something, annoyance maybe, or fear. The numbers don't add up, Katie continued, pulling out her phone and opening a spreadsheet she'd created. Based on the Roosevelt High model and the pattern you described, 12 districts over 5 years would yield closer to 15 million. You're holding back, Sandra's lawyer whispered urgently in her ear. Finally, Sandra sighed. Fine, 15 million, but I only kept a small percentage. The architect took most of it. Who is the architect? Walsh demanded. I don't know their real name. Everything was done through encrypted messages and cryptocurrency, but I have the communication protocols, the account numbers, the contact procedures. I can give you everything. For the next 3 hours, Sandra detailed the conspiracy. Katie took notes, cross-referencing everything with her own research. Several times, she caught Sandra trying to minimize her role or shift blame. And each time, Katie called her out with specific evidence. "You weren't recruited," Katie said at one point. "You were a founding member. The Delaware Shell Company was established 6 months before you claimed the architect contacted you." Sandra's carefully constructed narrative began to crumble. Under Katie's relentless fact-checking, the truth emerged. Sandra hadn't been a reluctant participant manipulated by some shadowy figure. She had been one of 3 people who started the entire scheme. The architect was real, but Sandra was his equal partner, not his subordinate. "The Jameson School District," Katie said suddenly, remembering something from her research. "You taught there 12 years ago. There was a financial scandal, but it was blamed on the superintendent who had just died of a heart attack." Sandra went very still. Walsh leaned forward. "Ms. Williams, what are you suggesting?" "I'm suggesting that Sandra has been doing this far longer than 5 years. The Roosevelt High model wasn't the beginning. It was the evolution of something she'd been perfecting for over a decade." The room fell silent. Sandra's lawyer demanded a break, but Walsh denied it. Under the pressure of Katie's revelations and the FBI's interrogation techniques, Sandra finally broke completely. 17 years, she whispered. "I've been doing this for 17 years, 23 districts, $32 million. The number hung in the air like a toxic cloud. $32 million stolen from education, from children, from futures. Katie felt sick thinking about how many students had gone without resources, how many programs had been cut, how many opportunities had been lost. "Names," Walsh said coldly. "We want every name, every contact, every conspirator." Sandra began listing names, and Katie recognized several. Respected educators, administrators, even a former state education official. The corruption went deeper than anyone had imagined. As Sandra talked, agents in the command center were already executing warrants, freezing accounts, making arrests. By the end of the day, the FBI had arrested 19 people across 4 states. The investigation would eventually expand to include 43 conspirators and recover $28 million. It would become one of the largest education fraud cases in American history. But for Katie, the personal cost was just beginning to reveal itself. As she left the federal building, exhausted and emotionally drained, she found reporters waiting. "Ms. Williams, how does it feel to be the whistleblower who exposed the largest school corruption ring in the country? Did you know Sandra Coleman was the mastermind when you started investigating? What made you suspicious in the first place?" Katie pushed through them without answering, but they followed her to her car, cameras flashing, microphones thrust in her face. This was the part she hadn't anticipated, the loss of anonymity, the transformation from teacher to reluctant celebrity. Agent Walsh appeared, helping Katie reach her vehicle. "This is going to get intense for a while. We can offer you protective custody if you're concerned about retaliation." "From who?" Katie asked. "Everyone's been arrested." "Not everyone. The architect is still out there, and with $32 million at stake, there might be people we don't know about yet who have a vested interest in silencing you." Katie hadn't considered this. She'd been so focused on exposing the conspiracy at Roosevelt High that she hadn't thought about the broader implications of what she'd uncovered. "I'll be careful," she promised, "but I'm not hiding. I have students to teach." The next few weeks were a blur of grand jury testimonies, evidence reviews, and legal procedures. Katie spent her days teaching and her evenings working with federal prosecutors to build airtight cases against the conspirators. She learned more about criminal law than she'd ever wanted to know. The trials began 3 months later. Sandra Coleman was first, charged with 127 counts of fraud, embezzlement, conspiracy, and money laundering. The prosecution's case was overwhelming, built largely on Katie's documentation and analysis. When Katie took the stand, the courtroom was packed with reporters, educators, and community members who had been affected by the conspiracy. "Ms. Williams," the prosecutor began, "can you walk us through how you first became suspicious of financial irregularities at Roosevelt High?" Katie spoke for 3 hours, detailing her investigation with the precision of a forensics expert and the passion of a teacher who had seen too much corruption. She explained the patterns she'd noticed, the evidence she'd gathered, the threats she'd endured. When the defense attorney tried to paint her as a disgruntled employee seeking attention, Katie calmly presented timestamp after timestamp, document after document, proof after proof. "I didn't want attention," Katie said firmly. "I wanted the money returned to the students it was stolen from. I wanted the toxic culture of intimidation to end. I wanted to be able to teach without fear." Sandra was convicted on all counts. As the verdict was read, she stared at Katie with undiluted hatred. But Katie felt no satisfaction, only sadness for the waste of potential Sandra represented. Roger Steele's trial was next. His defense was that he'd been manipulated by Sandra, that his gambling debts had made him vulnerable to coercion. The prosecution presented Katie's recordings of his physical assault and threats. "Listen to his voice," the prosecutor told the jury as Roger's recorded words filled the courtroom. "Does this sound like someone being manipulated, or someone enjoying the power to intimidate?" Roger was convicted on 15 counts. During sentencing, he actually apologized to Katie, claiming he'd lost his way and betrayed everything coaching was supposed to represent. Katie didn't believe him, but she appreciated the attempt at contrition. Principal Mitchell's trial was perhaps the most pathetic. His defense essentially boiled down to weakness and ignorance. He claimed he hadn't known about the embezzlement, had only looked the other way on the harassment, because he feared confrontation. Katie's testimony destroyed this narrative. She presented emails showing Mitchell had actively participated in financial decisions that enabled the fraud. She showed how he had deliberately ignored formal complaints, destroyed documentation, and protected the conspirators. Principal Mitchell had one job, Katie said during her testimony, to protect the educational environment of Roosevelt High. Instead, he sold that environment to criminals for the promise of a quiet life and a few $1,000s in kickbacks. Mitchell was convicted on 8 counts, his weakness proving no defense against his crimes. The trials continued for months. Linda Harper, the district financial officer, tried to blame sophisticated manipulation by Sandra, but Katie's forensic analysis showed Harper had actually initiated several of the fraudulent schemes herself. Sheriff Morrison claimed he was just protecting his son's future, but the jury didn't buy that his paternal concerns justified conspiracy and abuse of police power. Each trial was a reminder of how systemic the corruption had been, how many people had chosen personal gain over public trust. But each conviction was also a victory, a step toward justice and accountability. During this time, Katie continued teaching, though it wasn't easy. Her students treated her like a hero, which was uncomfortable. Other teachers were divided between those who admired her courage and those who resented the disruption she'd caused. Some blamed her for the negative attention on the school, as if exposing corruption was worse than the corruption itself. "You've destroyed this school's reputation," one veteran teacher told her in the break room. "It'll take years to recover from this scandal." "The scandal was happening before I arrived," Katie replied calmly. "I just refused to let it continue. And Roosevelt High's reputation will be built on truth and integrity, not on a lie maintained by fear and theft." The teacher stormed off, but others nodded in approval. Slowly, Katie was finding allies among the staff, teachers who had been silenced for years and were finally free to speak. One afternoon, 6 months after the FBI raid, Katie received an unexpected visitor. A woman in her 50s, well-dressed but tired-looking, knocked on her classroom door after school. "Miss Williams? I'm Dorothy Harrison. My husband David was the substitute teacher before you."
Katie immediately recognized the name. David Harrison had been driven out by false accusations of inappropriate conduct with students, accusations that had been dropped, but not before destroying his reputation. "Mrs. Harrison, please come in. I'm so sorry about what happened to your husband." Dorothy's eyes filled with tears. "He never recovered from it. The accusations were proven false, but the damage was done. He fell into depression, started drinking. We lost everything. He died 3 months ago. Heart attack, the doctors said. But I know it was the stress and shame that really killed him." Katie felt the weight of this revelation. David Harrison was a casualty of the conspiracy she'd exposed, a victim who hadn't lived to see justice served. "I'm so sorry," Katie said, feeling how inadequate the words were. "Don't be sorry," Dorothy said firmly. "Be proud. You did what David tried to do but couldn't. You had the skills and strength to fight back effectively. You've given me closure, knowing the people who destroyed my husband are paying for their crimes." She handed Katie an envelope. David kept journals. He documented everything that happened to him, hoping someday someone would care enough to listen. "I thought you might want them, for your students maybe, to show them that standing up for what's right sometimes comes with a terrible cost. But it's still worth doing." Katie accepted the journals with reverence. They would become part of her curriculum, teaching tools to show students the real price of integrity and the importance of systematic documentation. As the 1-year anniversary of the FBI raid approached, Roosevelt High had transformed completely. New leadership had been brought in, including a principal with a reputation for transparency and a school board committed to oversight. The recovered funds had been allocated to programs that had been neglected for years. The school's test scores were rising, teacher morale was improving, and most importantly, trust was being rebuilt. Katie's computer science and digital citizenship program had become a model for the district. Students learned not just coding and digital literacy, but also forensic accounting basics, documentation techniques, and ethical decision-making. Several of her students had already expressed interest in careers in law enforcement or financial investigation, inspired by her story. But the biggest change was in the culture. The fear that had permeated Roosevelt High was gone. Teachers collaborated openly, students felt safe reporting problems, and transparency was the new normal. Financial reports were posted publicly every month, vendor contracts were reviewed by committees, and whistleblower protections were strengthened. Katie had also changed. The naive substitute teacher who had walked into Roosevelt High wanting only to teach was gone. In her place was someone harder but wiser, someone who understood that education wasn't just about transmitting knowledge, but about fighting for the conditions that made learning possible. One evening, as she graded papers in her classroom, Agent Walsh visited. "We got him," Walsh said without preamble. Katie looked up, confused. "Who?" "The architect. Real name Benjamin Crawford, former superintendent from Ohio. Sandra's testimony, combined with your forensic work, led us right to him. He was hiding in Costa Rica, but we just extradited him. He's looking at life in prison." Katie felt a weight lift that she hadn't realized she'd been carrying. The last piece of the conspiracy had fallen. "There's something else," Walsh continued. "The Department of Education wants to hire you. They're creating a new division focused on preventing and detecting educational fraud. You'd be perfect to lead it." It was a tremendous opportunity.
a chance to prevent what had happened at Roosevelt High from happening elsewhere. Katie could make a difference on a national scale, save millions of dollars for education, protect countless teachers and students from corruption. "Can I think about it?" Katie asked. Walsh smiled. "Of course. But Katie, you should know that what you did here has already inspired similar investigations in other states. 3 more conspiracies have been exposed using your methods. You've started a movement." After Walsh left, Katie sat alone in her classroom, thinking about the journey from that first day when Roger had slammed her to the ground. She pulled out the button camera, now her paperweight, and turned it over in her hands. Such a small thing to have caused such massive change. Her phone buzzed with a text from one of her students. "Miss Williams, my code worked. The financial analysis program found 3 discrepancies in our mock corporation exercise. I feel like a real detective." Katie smiled. This was why she'd stayed in teaching despite everything. Not for glory or recognition, but for moments like this, when a student discovered their own power to uncover truth and fight for justice. The next morning, Katie made her decision. She called Agent Walsh and declined the federal position. "I appreciate the offer more than you know," Katie said, "but my place is here, in the classroom. The best way to prevent future corruption isn't just through investigation and prosecution, it's through education. If I can teach students to recognize corruption, to document evidence, to stand up for what's right, then I'm not just catching criminals after the fact. I'm preventing them from succeeding in the first place." Walsh was disappointed but understanding. "The offer stands if you change your mind. In the meantime, would you consider consulting, training our investigators in your documentation methods?" Katie agreed to occasional consulting, but her primary focus remained her students. She developed a curriculum that was eventually adopted statewide. Digital citizenship and ethical leadership, combining computer science with practical skills in investigation, documentation, and integrity. The second anniversary of the FBI raid was marked by a special ceremony at Roosevelt High. The recovered funds had now fully transformed the school. The computer lab was state-of-the-art. The library had doubled its collection. The music program had new instruments. And the athletic department had equipment that was actually safe and functional. Katie was asked to speak at the ceremony. She stood before an auditorium filled with students, teachers, parents, and community members. In the front row sat Dorothy Harrison, David's widow, who had become a regular volunteer at the school. Near the back, she spotted several of the substitute teachers who had been driven out before her, returned now that the environment was safe. 2 years ago, Katie began, I walked into this school as a substitute teacher, hoping to make a small difference in students' lives. What I found was a culture of fear, corruption, and theft. Some people asked me why I didn't just leave, find another school, avoid the conflict. She paused, looking at her students. The answer is simple. Because every day that corruption continued was another day students were robbed of opportunities. Every day that fear ruled these hallways was another day teachers couldn't do their real jobs. Every day that lies were protected was another day truth was betrayed. Fighting corruption isn't easy. I was threatened, assaulted, had my apartment burned, my life turned upside down. But look around you. Look at what we've built from the ashes of that corruption. This school is now a place of trust, transparency, and opportunity. That transformation was worth every risk. She held up the button camera, which had become the unofficial symbol of the transformation. This tiny camera captured crimes that stole $32 million from students across the country. But the real power wasn't in the technology. It was in the decision to use it, the courage to stand up. the determination to see justice done. Each of you has that same power. Maybe not with a camera, but with your voice, your integrity, your refusal to accept injustice. The question isn't whether you'll face corruption or wrongdoing in your life. You will. The question is whether you'll have the courage to document it, report it, and fight it. The applause was thunderous, but Katie wasn't finished. I want to end with a promise and a challenge. My promise is that as long as I'm teaching here, this classroom will be a place where truth matters, where integrity is valued, where courage is cultivated. My challenge to you is this: be the person who documents the wrongdoing. Be the person who stands up to bullies. Be the person who protects those who can't protect themselves. Be the person who chooses difficult truth over comfortable lies. As the ceremony ended, Katie was surrounded by students and parents thanking her. But the moment that mattered most came when Jessica, her student from that first terrible day, approached. "Miss Williams, I've decided what I want to study in college." "What's that, Jessica?" "Forensic accounting with a minor in education. I want to be like you, catching bad guys while teaching others to do the same." Katie felt tears sting her eyes. This was the real victory, not the arrests or convictions, but inspiring the next generation to fight for justice. As the sun set over Roosevelt High, Katie stood in her classroom one more time, looking at the evidence wall she'd created. Newspaper clippings about the trials, photos from the FBI raid, charts showing how the recovered money had been allocated, and in the center, that small button camera. But the wall also showed the future: student projects on ethical leadership, acceptance letters to colleges that students could now afford, photos from the new programs made possible by the recovered funds. The story that had begun with corruption and fear had become one of justice and hope. Her phone buzzed with an email from Agent Walsh. Another school district had uncovered potential fraud using the protocols Katie had developed. They wanted her advice on how to proceed. Katie smiled and began typing her response, sharing the documentation methods and investigative techniques she'd perfected. She might have chosen to remain a teacher instead of becoming a federal investigator, but that didn't mean she couldn't help catch criminals from her classroom. As she worked, she thought about Roger Steele in his federal prison cell, about Sandra Coleman serving her 20-year sentence, about all the conspirators who had thought they were untouchable. They had underestimated the power of one substitute teacher with a button camera and the determination to see justice done. The timestamp from that first assault still burned in her memory: 14:22 and 15 seconds. But now it wasn't a moment of victimization. It was the moment everything changed. The moment corruption began its countdown to exposure. The moment a substitute teacher decided that 72 hours wasn't a deadline for her evaluation, but a timeline for justice. Katie finished her email and prepared tomorrow's lesson plan. She was teaching her students about blockchain technology and how it could be used to create transparent, tamper-proof financial records for public institutions. It was advanced material, but her students were ready for it. They had learned that technology wasn't just about coding and computers. It was about using tools to protect truth and serve justice. As she locked her classroom that night, Katie paused at the door. A small plaque had been installed there by the school board. Ms. Katie Williams, Computer Science and Digital Citizenship. Truth is the foundation of education. But Katie knew the real message wasn't on the plaque. It was in the fearless atmosphere of the school, the empowered students, the transparent administration, and the knowledge that one person with courage really could change everything. The 72-hour deadline that had once threatened her career had become the 72 hours that transformed American education's approach to corruption. Katie Williams had come to Roosevelt High to teach, and in fighting for the right to do so, she had taught the most important lesson of all. Justice isn't given. It's taken. One timestamp, one recording, one piece of evidence at a time. Walking to her car under a clear night sky, Katie felt the weight of the button camera in her pocket. She still carried it everywhere, not because she expected to need it, but as a reminder of what one small tool in the hands of someone determined could accomplish. Tomorrow, she would teach her students about encryption and data protection. Next week, they would learn about financial analysis and pattern recognition. And throughout it all, she would weave in the most important lesson. Integrity isn't just about being honest. It's about having the courage and skills to ensure honesty prevails. The parking lot where Roger had threatened her was now well lit and monitored by security cameras that actually worked. The auxiliary gym where the conspiracy had been exposed was now a technology center where students learned the very skills that had exposed the corruption. Roosevelt High had been transformed from a monument to greed into a beacon of justice. As Katie drove home, she passed a billboard announcing Roosevelt High's latest achievement, National Excellence in Ethics Education Award. The school that had once been synonymous with corruption was now a model for ethical leadership. The transformation was complete, but the work continued. Because somewhere, in some other school, another corrupt administrator was skimming funds, another bully was intimidating teachers, another conspiracy was stealing from students, and Katie Williams was making sure that the next generation would be ready to stop them. The button camera had started it all, but it would be the students she taught who would finish it. They would go into the world armed with knowledge, skills, and most importantly, the courage to use both in service of justice. They would be forensic accountants and ethical hackers, investigative journalists and transparent administrators, teachers and FBI agents. They would be the generation that made corruption impossible because they made it visible. As Katie pulled into her driveway, her phone lit up with messages from her students sharing their final projects. One had created an app to track school spending in real time. Another had designed a blockchain system for vendor verification. A third had written an algorithm to detect anomalies in financial patterns. Each project was impressive, but more importantly, each one was a tool for justice. Her students weren't just learning technology, they were learning to weaponize transparency against corruption. They were becoming the guardians Roosevelt High had needed but never had until now. Katie's new apartment was modest but secure, with multiple locks and a sophisticated security system. She'd learned the hard way that fighting corruption came with risks. But as she settled in for the night, reviewing student projects and preparing tomorrow's lessons, she felt no fear, only purpose. The timestamp 14:22 and 15 seconds would always be with her. But now it was joined by thousands of other timestamps. Every lesson taught, every student inspired, every criminal exposed, every dollar recovered. The 72 hours that had threatened to end her career had instead launched a movement that would protect education for generations. And it all started with a button camera and a substitute teacher who refused to stay on the ground. 3 years later, Katie Williams stood before Congress, testifying about educational fraud prevention. The button camera sat on the table before her, now permanently retired, but still powerful as a symbol. Senators who had once dismissed school corruption as a local issue now listened intently as she outlined the national scope of the problem. This camera captured evidence of $32 million stolen from American students, Katie said, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had lived through fire and emerged stronger. But more importantly, it proved that one person with courage and the right tools can dismantle entire networks of corruption. The Katie Williams Educational Integrity Act passed unanimously, mandating forensic audits, whistleblower protections, and transparency requirements for all schools receiving federal funding. It was nicknamed the button camera law by the media, though its implications went far beyond surveillance. Back at Roosevelt High, Katie's former students were graduating, many heading to colleges they could afford thanks to recovered scholarship funds. Jessica gave the valedictorian speech, holding up her own button camera. Ms. Williams taught us that documentation is power, that truth is worth fighting for, and that sometimes the smallest tools can topple the biggest lies, Jessica said. We're not just graduates. We're corruption fighters, truth seekers, and protectors of justice. Katie watched from the audience, tears streaming down her face. Roger Steele was still in prison. Sandra Coleman's appeal had been denied. The architect would die behind bars, but their legacy of fear had been completely erased, replaced by a generation that would never tolerate such corruption again. The revolution hadn't started with the FBI raid or the trials. It had started the moment Katie Williams decided that "try saying that on the ground" would be her battle cry, not her surrender.
You are not alone. Someone wants to hear you. Share your story. Thank you for watching to the end. Please like and subscribe to Stereo.